You've come sort of out of that engineering perspective, that background, and then joining SPE, and we talked off air about you really getting to travel the world as president of that organization. That must have really, I mean, every time I go to even a small local event, I learn things. So I can't imagine the amount of knowledge and just sort of eye-opening things that you saw traveling around in that role.
Yeah, it was a tremendous eye-opening experience. I wish that I could have done it earlier in my career, but it was later in my career, but I'm still very thankful for it. But what I realized very quickly in the start of my 3-year commitment. So I spent 3 years as an international board member with the Society of Petroleum Engineers, which was great, and I thought that was great. And then I wound up becoming the SP president globally, which is another 3 years. So I spent 6 years
Wow.
in a very influential role. And what I first realized, having spent 25, 30 years mostly in North America, primarily in North America, is we live in a bubble in Calgary. Everything is myopic. Everything is an echo chamber. It just gets smaller and smaller as the problems get worse. And all we can see is past the edge of our bubble. And maybe there's a pipeline issue there, or maybe there's a border issue there, or maybe there's a Permian Basin issue there. And everything is very Calgary centric. And I realized it took me 49 different countries, about 75 trips to those 49 different countries, and 158 speeches. But I did realize by the end of my time that the world is so much different and so much bigger. And we here in the Canadian oil patch represent a small segment of that. And the world is so diverse, and we just need to get out there and see it.
Did you when you said that you realized that, did you realize there was that bubble before, or did it actually change you doing that travel those travels?
Mostly it changed me, but I think if you can hearken back, or if the people who are listening to this can think back to 20 or 30 years ago, we had some large Canadian independent oil and gas companies that were working abroad. So here in Calgary in the 80s and 90s, we had a bit more of an international focus when we had, you had lots of colleagues that would spend time in a Canadian company, perhaps working in Africa or Southeast Asia or Europe. And so there was a little bit more of an international flavor 20 years ago.
Mm.
And I think just because of markets, just because of the way things went, because of the model that worked very well for us in Calgary, of the small company being amalgamated by the big company, we became more myopic. So I think, in fairness, I did have a broader view 20 years ago,
Mm.
but when you're just in the bubble all the time, only thinking of your space, human nature is, we think of those around us, and sometimes we even wonder about them, right? So that's just the way we do it. And it was just so refreshing to get out there and realize, most of the oil companies on earth are national oil companies. Almost all the lands on earth are owned by the crown or the government or the state. I mean, it's so different than what we get huddled into in this North American model all the time. So it was a good reminder, but I did learn a tremendous amount.
I actually wanted to, if you could. I mean, this is a big question, and I'm obviously not. I mean, we'd probably need about 40 shows to even begin to scrape the surface of it. But I wanted to understand, because I haven't traveled to 75 countries, and a lot of the audience isn't going to have done it. So can you actually set up a little bit, Darcy, of the energy system, the US system, the Canadian system, the global, just on that surface level of just sort of what you've seen and what you understand these systems to be in the energy sector specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. In my viewpoint, I'm not an expert. I'm an observer. Um, a land person, members of the AIPN, the petroleum negotiator people, they're much more familiar with systems and the negotiating patterns and joint venture agreements versus production sharing agreements and all these things on the global stage. But in general, in general, most of the world, and think of the countries in the world. I mean, top five. I think top five producer. Number one is U.S. Number two is Saudi. Number three is Russia. Number four is somebody. Number five is Canada. I mean, that's kind of the way it is.
Mhm.
But if you think in that top 10, let's say, um, most of those countries, the company is the country. So Saudi Aramco is a great example. So you have all this mineral wealth, tremendous mineral wealth, but the company is the best government post you can have is looking after that. So the country is the company, is the regulator, is the employer. And that's a lot of the oil and gas produced on Earth. And that's not bad. The variety within that segment is huge. But basically, most oil and gas is the country, is the company. Then you get places that are more like us, where the crown or the state, Norway. Well, Norway is not the best example here, but in the UK or Europe, places in Europe, Australia, Canada, where the crown or the regulator is the government, and industry has to collaborate with government. Their royalty partner is the government, and so we learn to deal with that, and that's the way. So that's the other big chunk of oil and gas operations globally. And then you look at the very anomalous place in the United States, which is the number one producer, where it's primarily, not everywhere, but primarily freehold.
Mhm.
So all of a sudden, you get a driver that's completely different. You get a privately held mineral, which might be a very large old money group out of somewhere on the eastern seaboard. It might be what they may call fee lands. I worked about a third of my career in the U.S. It might be the farmer who's on surface. It might be just a random person, or it might be the oil company. So it's not often the government, unless you're on a reservation or an offshore block or a preserve. Um, so so the U.S. system, in my mind, is driven by different drivers and very different. That's who we see every day in the paper when we compare ourselves. We don't compare ourselves to Romania. We don't
Right.
compare ourselves to Vietnam. We compare ourselves to the Americans. They're our neighbor, they're our trading partner, they're our customer, pretty much number one. So everything we look at is how that's affecting our market. And I beg my colleagues to take a step back and say, no, what's Russia doing in the innovation side?
Mm.
Because they're one quick boat trip away, and they can come across the Arctic and ship. So what are they doing? Uh, there's a lot of different dynamics of some very significant players. And of course, again, we could take 40 shows to talk about this, but the political changes in the US as of the last few weeks certainly could change the flavor.
Mm.
And suddenly we, their neighbor, might be in a much better space from a banking and regulatory point of view, because the stuff we've been practicing for a decade, i.e., methane emissions mitigation and measurement, we might be ahead of the game and a really good neighbor to have for the American administration. So I just go off on this rant quite frequently about, look at the holistic part of the world. Look at what China's doing. Look at what Guyana's doing.
Mm.
Look at what Russia's doing. Look at what Norway's doing. Don't just always look at what West Texas is doing. That's a bad measure.